Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com presents the Strength Coach Podcast, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. PerformBetter.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 181.5, special episode of the Strength Coach Podcast, the official podcast of Michael Boyle, StrengthCoach.com, the world's best source for strength and conditioning information. Remember, you can try StrengthCoach.com out for 3 days, just $1. And if you have a staff of 2 or more and you want to sign up as a group, we have a special membership offer for you, up to 50% off, depending on how many people you have. Remember, we got the Miami Dolphins whole athletic performance team just signed up as a group. Great stuff from them. Now, remember, this is the best place to have access to Coach Boyle. He's on the forum every single day. Check it out at StrengthCoach.com. All right, I'm your host, Anthony Wren, and the show notes are located at StrengthCoachPodcast.com. Want to get in touch with me? Shoot me an email to StrengthCoachPodcast@gmail.com. Okay, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that Frank Dolan has been doing a review of all 7 screens of the FMS. So what I wanted to do for this episode was just put them all together in one episode so you can get a better feel for them all at once. So how this came about was when I was assisting Frank with an FMS class for Nike, I saw the difficulty that some really smart and talented trainers had with some of the information. And I think mostly it was because, it could be overwhelming at times. So I felt like some of them were focusing on things that really weren't as important when first learning the screen. And so I wanted to get Frank on to do a review of the screens to remind trainers the importance of consistency for reliability of the screens. If you're on StrengthCoach.com, you know we have a special forum just for FMS questions, and Brett Jones is on there all the time, and he talks about this all the time, about the script, about saying the same thing every time. And, actually it's obviously important that we all say the same thing every time, so we can get some good reliability for the screens. So that's really how this started. So this is really just all 7 of those episodes, that piece of the episode, the FMS segment, put together all in one. So let's get on the phone with Coach Dolan.
Hi, I'm Frank Dolan, and I'm here to discuss today, as part of the Functional Movement Systems segment, a new series on the basics of the FMS. It's just a basic review of the fundamental things like the verbal instructions, some tips for testing, the criteria for each test, and then some of the nuances that are often missed with each test. Today we're going to discuss the deep squat. One of the things that's important about the deep squat is to understand that we are just looking at these criteria, and that we need, for consistency and reliability, to have the verbal instructions be the same across the board. So everyone doing a functional movement screen test and doing the deep squat has to be using those same verbal instructions. When learning the deep squat, it's important to utilize your own language when learning to view the criteria in the same way, but then eventually mold the way that you're doing the squat and use the verbal instructions in the manual. They are as follows. You want to ask the client that they please let you know if they have any pain while performing the movement that they tell you. You're going to instruct them to stand tall with feet approximately shoulder width apart and toes pointed directly forward. They'll grasp the dowel in both hands and place it horizontally on top of their head so they know that their shoulders and elbows are at 90 degrees. You're going to check their elbows, make sure they're at 90 with their hand position. They'll press the dowel so that it's directly above their head. While maintaining an upright torso and keeping your heels and the dowel in position overhead, they'll descend as deep as possible. They'll hold that descended position for a count of 1, then return to the starting position. You would then instruct them to tell you if they understand the instructions. The equipment needed here is just going to be a 2x6 and the dowel. Some of the tips for testing on the deep squat are that the client can perform the movement up to 3 times if necessary. If they're unable to perform the test with the heels flat, you would then give them an additional 3 chances to check with the heels elevated. If a score of 3 is not achieved, they repeat the above instructions using the 2x6 under the heels. You will observe the client from the front and the side, so you're going to want to move around. All positions, including the foot position, should remain unchanged when the heels are elevated with either the FMS kit or a smaller size board. Some of the common questions, mistakes, and some of the nuances that are often missed in the deep squat test is that the foot position changes, whether that's kind of that bad game of telephone or someone that just learned it incorrectly. We want to make sure that the foot position is straight, regardless of how you squat in the gym for exercise. For the test, we want to make sure the toes are pointed straight ahead. If loss of balance happens at the top of the screen, that's another one where the squat actually might look good, but then they lose balance at the finish of the test. That's another issue that we want to make sure we're catching. We want to make sure we're moving around the client, not just staying in one place. We move from the side to the front or from the front to the side. We do not demo the movement or show them in advance. We also don't allow them to do it in a mirror. We don't want to give them that extra cueing of being able to see themselves in the mirror. We want them to do the test with shoes on, some type of footwear that they would train in. They're going to perform, as mentioned earlier, 3 reps with the heels down. If they're able to do that, we don't have to move on to the 3 reps with the heels up. It's a common question. We want to use the note section on the scorecard as a way to write down observations, but not to write down what you think the issue is. It's a common mistake where we start to try to play detective and figure out what the issue is with the squat. It's important to write down observations of what you're seeing, but not as it pertains to what you think the problem is. Just look at the score, 3, 2, 1, or 0, and write down any kind of weird stuff that you see. If the movement is performed as a 3, but there still is pain with the movement, it's still a 0. We want to make sure that we're holding for 1 second at the bottom of the squat. That's often missed. That's part of those instructions, those verbal instructions. We do want to see a quick pause at the bottom before they come back up. We want to also make sure that their heels, when they're checking for a 2, that you're careful that the heels are on the board, not their midfoot. We don't want them all the way up and over the top of the board. Just the heels need to be up there with toes straight ahead. Okay, then we'll look at really quickly some of the criteria. To get a 3 on the squat, the upper torso must be parallel with the tibia or toward vertical. The other criteria is that the femur must be below horizontal, or their butt needs to be below the knees. The knees should be aligned over the feet, and the dowel needs to be aligned over the feet. So we shouldn't see any valgus in the knees or knees pointed out. They should be lined up with the feet with the heels flat, and the dowel should be aligned over the footprint of where the feet are. A 2, it's the same criteria as a 3, except that we have the heels elevated. And as mentioned earlier, just the heels, not the midfoot on the board. To get a 1, you would miss one of those criteria with the heels elevated. So the tibia and upper torso is not parallel, the femur is not below horizontal, knees not aligned over the feet, and the dowel not aligned over the footprint. If pain is present, we're going to give that client a 0 for that portion of the test, and a medical professional should perform a thorough evaluation of that painful area to make sure we find out what the issue is there before we go ahead and have that person go through exercise. Today we're going to discuss the hurdle step. One of the things we'll do is make sure that everyone is doing the same thing for consistency and reliability in the test. So we'll review the verbal instructions, some tips for testing, the criteria for each test, and then some of the nuances that are often missed, common questions and mistakes that we see in workshops. To start out, the verbal instructions for the hurdle step, we want to make sure we're following these verbal instructions after we get comfortable screening the test and finding criteria. We want to try to make sure that we're migrating towards using the exact verbal instructions with each client. So when you take your practice tests, when you're doing your practice FMS after getting the certification, it's important to migrate towards these specific verbal instructions. So we're going to start with having the client let you know if there is any pain with the movement, that they give you that indication. We want to make sure we let them know that up front. Then we'll instruct them to stand tall with the feet together and toes touching the test kit. So that's actually both sneakers touching together and the toes touching the kit. We'll then instruct them to grasp the dowel with both hands and place it behind their neck and across the shoulders, very similar to holding it like a squat bar. While maintaining an upright torso, they'll raise the right leg to step over the hurdle, making sure to raise the foot towards the shin and maintaining foot alignment with the knee, ankle, and hip. They will then touch the floor with the heel and return that foot back to the starting position while maintaining foot alignment with the ankle, knee, and hip. You would then ask them if they understand these instructions. You're going to need a dowel and a hurdle to perform this test. Some of the tips for testing here are that we ensure that the cord is aligned properly. So we take a measurement before we do the test of the tibial tuberosity. We'll have them stand next to the kit and get that measurement from the bottom of the floor to the tibial tuberosity and move both pieces of the string on the kit to make sure that it's aligned properly. We'll then tell the client to stand as tall as possible at the beginning of the test. We're going to be scoring the moving leg. So if the moving leg is the left side, we're going to put the left side score in the left side column on the scorecard. The client can perform the movement up to 3 times on each side if necessary. They get 3 for each. We'll watch for a stable torso. We're going to observe from the front and from the side, and we want to make sure the toes of the stance leg stay in contact with the hurdle during each and after each repetition. Okay, we'll move on to a few nuances and common mistakes. Again, we want to make sure we're scoring the moving leg. We do not want to use a mirror. We don't want to give them that extra cueing by having them see themselves in the mirror. We want all the tests done exactly the same. So if we're using a mirror for some people and not for others, we're not going to have that consistency and reliability. The toes need to be directly up against the board. I think that's one that we see a lot, where it's said but not often done. We want to move around the client, as mentioned earlier. We don't want to demo it. We don't want to show them what the movement looks like. We're just going to use those verbal instructions. If loss of balance is noted and they can't return their foot back to the original starting position, it's not a 2. That's going to be considered a 1 because they lost their balance. We want to do the test with shoes on. It's going to significantly change the outcome of the test if we're doing this barefoot. We want them to be using shoes that they would use in a training situation. They do get 3 reps on each side, as mentioned before. If you are going to take notes as a coach, we want to make sure that you're not trying to figure out and play detective and know what the exact problem is of why there is movement dysfunction going on. You just would make notes on what those movement dysfunctions are. So just be observational, not try to figure things out, because we want to look at the entire score, the entire FMS raw scores to decide where to go next. If they perform the movement perfect, but it still hurts, it is still a 0. If the back of the leg touches the cord when they step over, so they'll touch the heel on the opposite side of the hurdle, but the back of their leg or their pants touches the cord, that's okay. That doesn't mean that they get a 1 on that. It's only if the foot touches the cord on the way over or on the way back that it would be considered a 1. The outside of the stick, if they go with their foot outside of the stick, they're technically not stepping over the cord, so that could not be considered a 2 or a 3. That's going to be a 1. Also, take a check. Sometimes people don't look enough at the stick. If the stick is being tilted or if someone's pulling down on the stick to create some stability. That's also going to be considered not a compensation, not being able to do the movement perfectly as a 3. We want to make sure that stance leg also stays still. That's a common thing that we're not looking at. We get so concerned about the moving leg that we're not paying attention to the stance leg. That's got to stay toe straight ahead, touching the kit. All right, and then we'll just quickly go through some of the scoring. To get a 3, the hips, knees, and ankles remain aligned in the sagittal plane. They need to have minimal to no movement noted in the lumbar spine. And again, the dowel and hurdle will remain parallel. That also includes bending the stick. That's no good as well. To get a 2 on this test, they would have to have alignment being lost with their hips, knees, and ankles. That's usually going to show up at the foot. Movement is going to be noted in the lumbar spine, and the dowel and the hurdle do not remain parallel. So they don't need to have all of those mistakes, just one of those mistakes to get a 2 on this test. To get a 1, that would be contact between the foot and the hurdle, or if, as mentioned before, they go outside of the 2 sticks, and loss of balance noted. So that's on the way over, or even when they go ahead and try to return that foot back to the original starting position, they may lose their balance, and that would be considered a 1. If pain is associated with any portion of the test, it is a 0, and a medical professional should be consulted to do a thorough evaluation of the painful area. For this segment, I'll be discussing the inline lunge. Today we're going to cover, for the inline lunge, some of the verbal instructions that it's really important to stay on, some tips for testing, the scoring criteria for the test, and then some of the nuances that are often missed, common questions, and common mistakes. All right, to start out, we're going to look at just some of the things that you're going to want to make sure that you're saying as far as the verbal instructions go to the client. We want to follow this script, especially when you first learn the screen, to make sure that we're keeping the consistency and the reliability of the test. You're going to instruct the client to let you know if they have any pain while performing the following movement. You'll have them step onto the 2x6 with a flat right foot. This is if we're scoring the left side, and your toe on the 0 mark. So on the board, they're going to put their right foot flat on the kit with their toe on the 0. The left heel should be placed according to the tibial measurement marker. So you would get the tibial tuberosity measurement height in the hurdle step test. You're going to use that same number here to indicate where you have them put their left heel in this case. Both toes must be pointed forward with flat feet on the board to start. They'll place the dowel along the spine so it touches the back of their head, their upper back, and the middle of their buttocks. While grasping the dowel, their right hand should be against the back of the neck. So the top arm, that hand will be behind the neck, and the left hand should be against their lower back or at the small of their back. Maintaining an upright posture so the dowel stays in contact with their head, upper back, and top of their butt, they descend into a lunge position so the right knee touches the 2x6 behind the left heel. They will return to the starting position from there. You'll ask them if they understand the instructions and proceed with the test. The equipment here you'll need is the dowel and, of course, the 2x6 board. Some of the tips for testing is that we want to make sure that we're scoring the front leg. So in the case that we talked about in the verbal instructions, that's going to be the left side. We want to make sure the dowel remains vertical and in contact with their head, thoracic spine, and sacrum throughout the movement. The front heel must remain in contact with the board, and the back heel must touch the board when returning to the start position. We're watching for loss of balance and any movement in those feet. We want to remain close to the client to prevent the complete loss of balance for safety. We repeat the test on both sides, scoring if the right leg is forward, that's a right side score. And the client can perform the movement up to 3 times on each side if necessary to make sure that we're scoring the best out of those 3. The criteria that we're looking for to get a 3, 2, 1, or 0, of course, if there is pain at present with any of the movement, it's a 0. To get a 3, the dowel must maintain contact with the head, the back, and the butt. They have to keep the dowel vertical. No torso movement must be noted, and the dowel and feet must remain in the sagittal plane. The knee should touch behind the board of the heel of the front foot, or on the board behind the heel of the front foot. To get a 2, the dowel may come off the head, the back, or the butt. If the dowel does not remain vertical, so typically a forward movement. If movement is noted in the torso, any type of rotation. If the dowel and the feet do not remain in the sagittal plane. If the knee does not touch behind the heel of the front foot, we cannot give them a 3. To get a score of 1, we would see loss of balance, and we would see an inability to complete the movement pattern as a whole. Some of the common nuances that are often missed in questions and mistakes is that we see a foot position that's not straight ahead, especially with the back foot. If someone cannot get in the position, that would count as a 1. We're not seeing them have the ability to get on the board and get in position to have the test done. So we have to score that a 1. The knee must touch behind the front foot. As mentioned in the criteria, that's just something that we commonly see is that the knee falls outside of that line. You do not want to tell them their mistakes throughout the test. This is commonly seen as well. We can only repeat instructions. If you see that the foot's not straight or you see that the stick's coming off their back, you can't tell them what they're doing wrong. Just repeat the instructions that you gave them from the beginning. Return the back heel back to the board is another one. If
just going ahead into the lunge. They come back up and the back heel remains off the board. We want to see that heel comes back to the original start position. So again, we would just repeat instructions and have them go back to the original start position. The top elbow can come forward. So as long as the hand is behind the top hand is behind the neck, it's okay where that elbow position is, as long as they're in that same position with the stick touching their head, their back, and their butt. The hand position is important. We want to make sure that they do have the hand behind the neck and the bottom hand behind the small of the back. It can't be outside of those 2 points. And I think one of the things that we see a lot of is that people are looking at one specific area. So they're either looking at the feet or they're looking at the stick. We want to make sure we're looking at both positions. So look at the entire picture, not just one point of focus. For this segment, I'll be discussing shoulder mobility. We're going to discuss some of the verbal instructions, some tips for testing, the scoring criteria we're looking for, as well as some of the nuances that are often missed, the common questions and mistakes that we see. So to start out, we'll talk about those verbal instructions and making sure the script is always the same, using those same words for the instructions so that we have consistency and reliability in the test. We're going to ask that the client make sure to let us know if they have any pain with the movement to start. We'll then ask them to stand tall with their feet together and arms hanging comfortably at their sides. We'll have them make a fist so that their fingers are around their thumbs, and in one motion, place the right fist over the head and down your back as far as possible, while simultaneously taking your left fist up your back as far as possible. We're going to have them ask them to not creep their hands closer after the original initial placement, and ask them if they understand the instructions. We're just going to use the dowel to measure the distance between the knuckles of the hands. Some of the tips for testing that we want to take a look at is that we are scoring the side of the top shoulder. So when we put the score on our scorecard, the top shoulder is the side we're scoring. Doesn't necessarily mean it's that side's problem, but we want to make sure that we're scoring the same side for everybody. If the hand measurement is the same as the distance between 2 points, score low. So that goes saying with most of the tests that we want to make sure when in doubt we score low. We want to make sure the client does not try to walk the hands towards each other following the initial placement. So you can see sometimes people will bend their back and creep the hands together, or even if they just place it in one position and creep them together, that's no good. We want them to repeat that. We then want to have them repeat the test on the opposite side. So I'll quickly go over the other little piece of this test, which is the shoulder clearing test. This is the first test in the FMS that has a clearing test. In this one, we're just going to really quickly check and make sure that they don't have pain with this one specific movement. So we'll have them stand tall with their feet together and arms hanging comfortably, just like they did in the shoulder mobility test. They'll place their right palm on the front of their left shoulder. So whichever arm they're doing, we're going to have them place that hand on the opposite side shoulder, keeping their palm flat. So while maintaining palm placement, raise the right elbow as high as possible. And then ask them the question, do you feel any pain? In this case, if we do have pain here, they may have a perfect 3 on the actual shoulder test and still have pain with this movement. It's still a 0. We're going to make sure that they can perform and try this on both sides, checking for the actual score, 3, 2, or 1, or if they have pain with the actual movement would be a 0, and then we'll actually have them go through the clearance test on both sides. The scoring criteria for the shoulder mobility test is that to get a 3, we want to have the fists fall within 1 hand length. So prior to the test, we take a measurement from their dominant hand. So we're going to take a look at their righty, take a look at their right hand. We're going to measure from the distal wrist crease to the end of their middle finger. That's going to be our hand length. If their fists can fall behind their back in that test between that length, then it's a 3. If they fall outside of that length, then we're going to look at either a 2 or a 1. So outside of that length, it could possibly be a 2. If it's outside of that hand length and a half, then it's going to be a 1. So this is really just a quick measurement between the 2 fists to check and make sure that they're either falling within 1 hand length of 3, 2 is outside of that hand length but within 1.5 hand lengths, and then a 1 is if they can't get within 1.5 hand lengths. If an individual has pain with this movement, it's going to be a 0. And then we will take a quick test of the clearance, palm on the shoulder, lifting the elbow. Does it hurt? A couple of things that we see, some of those nuances that are often missed, is that sometimes people don't instruct their client to have their feet together. Sometimes they allow them to bend over. That's no good. We don't want them to bend over and be able to get their hands closer in that. Sometimes you'll see people do this really fast, and they can get further with that. So watch the speed. Make sure they're doing it at a slow pace. And they sometimes will do the shoulder clearance first. Let's just try to keep the consistency and reliability of the test by doing it the same every time. We're going to have them do the shoulder mobility test, then do the clearance after the test. Today we'll cover the active straight leg raise. In order for consistency and reliability of the test, it'll be important that we follow the same verbal instructions, some key tips for testing, criteria for the test, and then some of the nuances and often missed items, as well as questions and mistakes that people make. So we'll get through first some of those verbal instructions. We want to make sure that we're saying this exactly the way that it's written. This way we have that consistency and reliability of the test. We're going to instruct the client to let us know if they have any pain while performing any of the movement. We'll have them lay flat on their back with their knees against the 2x6 and their toes pointed up. So we'll usually have them place their head on one side of the kit, their feet on the opposite side of the kit with their knees over the board or over the 2x6. We'll have them place both arms next to their body with the palms facing up. We'll begin with the feet together in a neutral position, so toes are going to be pointed straight up. With the scoring leg remaining straight and the back of the opposite knee maintaining contact with the 2x6, they'll raise the scoring leg as high as possible. So the moving leg is the side that we're scoring. You'll ask them if they understand those instructions. And that is basically our script when we get them started for the verbal instructions. Some things that we need to know is that we are going to take a measurement from the ASIS, or anterior superior iliac spine, down to the midline of the knee joint. So we'll take that measurement with the stick and create a midpoint between the ASIS and the midpoint of the patella. Okay, that point is going to indicate if the person scores a 3 or a 2, so that's an important point. Some of the tips for testing is that the moving leg is going to be identified as the side being scored, so just do a little review there. If there is difficult finding the joint line, you can have them flex the knee to make sure that you can see where the middle of that patella is. You want to make sure that the non-moving limb maintains a neutral position. We'll have them repeat the test on both sides, make sure we're scoring both, and the client can perform the movement up to 3 times on each side if necessary. The criteria to get a 3 is that the vertical line of the malleolus, so that little round bone on the outside part of the ankle, resides between the mid-thigh and the ASIS. So it's got to pass that point that you're placing the stick between the patella and the ASIS. The non-moving limb must also remain in that neutral position and completely still. To get a 2, the moving leg is not passing that midpoint of the thigh. So the vertical line of the malleolus resides between the mid-thigh and the joint line of the patella. The non-moving limb also needs to remain in the neutral position. To get a 1 on the test, the vertical line of the malleolus resides at the top of the movement below the joint line, so they're not able to pass the opposite side knee with the malleolus. The non-moving limb also in this case remains in that neutral position. If any pain is reported with this movement, we're going to give them a 0 on the test. So some of the tips for testing we've covered already. We've covered the criteria. Let's just talk really quick on some nuances. We want to make sure, this is review, but making sure that the palms are up at their sides. If they're able to press down with their hands, that's going to create a little bit of stabilization that can help them with the test. We don't want that. We want palms up. We want to make sure that the neck is relaxed. They shouldn't be watching their feet by, crimping their neck and looking down at their legs. We want to make sure they're relaxed through the neck. The bottom leg, it's key that we make sure that knee does not bend. That's supposed to stay touching the 2x6 on the down leg. The foot shouldn't move in or out. We can use our finger or a pen to not hold the foot in position,
but potentially just feel for movement. So if the foot moves out, which is typically what would happen with the compensation, you can feel that pressure. You don't want to hold the foot in place. You just want to feel for movement so that you can tell them that's the end of the movement. We want to make sure that the speed is at a very slow pace. If they're moving the leg very rapidly, they're going to be able to pass a point that maybe they don't really own, and you may not be able to see that the knee bends or some other movement goes on at the foot. So we want to make sure that speed stays slow. The lifted leg knee could potentially bend as well. Sometimes you'll see that. That would indicate that they shouldn't keep moving forward, right? You only want to go as far as they can go with that knee being straight. Some people do have a little bit of slight knee bend. I've heard some people not being able to straighten out all the way. Their terminal knee extension is not the same as most people. That's okay as long as you don't see any extra knee bend as they start to move up, okay? Because they probably will be able to keep the back of the knee touching the 2x6 in that start position with a slight knee bend. If they keep that same angle of knee bend throughout the movement, that's totally fine. As mentioned before, we want to make sure that the instructions are consistent across the board for reliability. This way everyone's doing the test exactly the same. In this segment, we'll talk trunk stability push-up. We'll cover some verbal instructions, some tips for testing, all the scoring criteria for a 3, 2, 1, or 0, as well as some testing nuances, common questions, and mistakes. To start out, we want to make sure that our verbal instructions are very close or right on the point with all of these exact words. This way we can keep the consistency and reliability of the test. Before we start the test, we'll ask them to let us know if there's any pain while performing the movement, and then we'll have them lie face down with their arms extended overhead and hands shoulder width apart, or distal aspect of the thumbs in line with the AC joint. So just think on their bellies with the arms out overhead, thumbs in line with the shoulders. We're going to have them pull their thumbs down in line with, for the men, the forehead, and for the women, the chin. From there, we'll have them with both legs together. We'll have them pull their toes towards their shins and lift their knees up and elbows up off the ground. While maintaining a rigid torso, they'll push their body up as one unit into a push-up position. And then you ask them if they understand these instructions. You don't need any equipment for this. This is just body weight. So moving on to some of the criteria for each one. To get a 3, the men need to perform that push-up with the thumbs aligned with the top of the head. The women, the thumbs need to be aligned with the chin, and we have to see that the body lifts up as one unit with no lag in the spine. If they can't do that, we ask them to start back on their belly, and for men, they slide their hands down to the chin. For women, they slide down to the clavicle. So for a 2, men can perform the repetition correctly with the thumbs aligned with the chin. Women can perform it with the thumbs aligned with the clavicle. We're looking for, again, that the body lifts as one unit with no lag in the spine, just like as we did for the 3, just different hand position. If they can't do that, we would score that test a 1. So if men are unable to perform the repetition with the thumbs aligned with the chin, it's a 1. And for women, if they're not able to do it aligned with the clavicle, it's a 1. We don't need to test anything else after that. If they can't do it, it's a 1. If there's any pain associated with any portion of the test, we score that as 0. There's also an additional clearance test, just like in the shoulder mobility, which is going to take a look at spinal extension. We're going to have them start out right in that same position, belly on the ground, shoulders underneath, or hands underneath their shoulders. They can extend their elbows. Doesn't matter how high up they get their chest, but almost into this cobra stretch with their hips on the ground. So the hips remain on the floor. They're going to extend their elbows as far as they feel comfortable with, and then we can just ask them how that feels and if there is any pain. If it does provoke some pain, it's going to be a positive right next to that test. We can score that positive for pain. If not, we score it negative for pain. Now we can get into some of the tips for testing. Okay, the client should be able to lift the body up as a unit, as indicated earlier. On each attempt, they must make sure that the client's hand position and head position is the same. So we don't want to see that the hands slide down as the client prepares to do the push-up. That's sometimes something you'll see. They'll slide real quick right before they push off. We want to make sure the hands stay in the same place. We want to make sure the chest and the stomach come
off the floor simultaneously, so we need to see that right at the same time. The client can perform the movement up to 3 times if necessary, so they do get 2 additional chances if you feel that they could possibly get it. And then we repeat the instructions with the appropriate hand placement if they don't get the first one. Just a couple of quick nuances. We want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on if they're pushing off with their elbows and knees. What tends to help with that is if we make sure that we instruct that they keep their elbows up and knees up off the ground before they go ahead and push. We want to make sure we're cueing that, cueing elbows up and cueing knees off the ground. We want to watch for rotation as well, so we don't want to see one side dip. That's going to indicate that they're not able to keep that position as they come up out of the push-up. We want to make sure, as mentioned earlier, that they don't slide their hands down first. That would make it no good. We've got to retest. I think probably the best vantage point is from the side. This way we can see that the shoulders and hips are coming up simultaneously. And then just as a side note and use of common sense, sometimes if you have a person who could be significantly overweight, obviously, we do want to do all the tests, but if the case comes up with a person does have a large stomach and it's your first session with the person, we have to use common sense in these examples and make sure we're not putting someone in a position where they're going to feel really uncomfortable, where we're standing over them and they're on the ground in a position that they really can't get into. They're probably not going to be able to get that push-up anyway. It might make more sense to move on and just give them a 1 on that one. In this segment, we'll be talking rotary stability. We'll cover some verbal instructions, your tips for testing, the criteria for a 3, 2, 1, or 0, as well as some testing nuances and possible common questions and mistakes people make on this test. Let's start out with the verbal instructions that we want to use with the client when we get started to make sure we maintain consistency and reliability of the test. We're going to start out by asking the client to let us know if they have any pain with any of the movement. Then we'll have them get on their hands and knees over the 2x6 so that their hands are under their shoulders and knees are under their hips. It's critical to look at 90 degrees at the shoulders and 90 degrees at the hips. The thumbs, knees, and toes must contact the sides of the 2x6, and the toes must be pulled towards the shins. At the same time, they're going to reach their right hand forward and right leg backwards, so a simultaneous reaching with the arm and leg like you're flying. Then, without touching down, touch the right elbow to right knee directly over the 2x6 and return to that extended position or that flying position, and then return back to the starting position in quadruped. You can ask them if they understand the instructions and obviously make sure that they perform this test on the opposite side as well. So we're going to test the right side and then we're going to test the left side. We're scoring the moving arm, so when we are testing, if we're moving right arm and right leg, it's going to be the right side. When we check for a 2, I'm getting ahead, but when we check for a 2, it's the moving arm. If we check right side arm, left leg, we're still scoring the right side in that case. We will then go ahead and let's get to some of the actual criteria for the test. To get a 3, we're going to have them reach out with the arm and leg on the same side, so it's a unilateral repetition, and the touch of the elbow to knee must be over the 2x6 board. To get a 2, if we see that they cannot perform the 3, they fall over or they lean to the side or tilt, we would check to see if they can touch opposite side elbow to opposite side knee. So if they perform a correct diagonal repetition, they get a 2. We also want to make sure that we see that the diagonal knee and elbow meet over the 2x6 board. And then if they can't do the 2 test, they would get a 1 on that test. So inability to perform a diagonal repetition would result in a 1. And again, if there's any pain with any portion of this test, we want to make sure we get that evaluated. There's also a spinal flexion clearing test with this one, just like shoulder mobility and trunk stability push-up has a quick clearance test. This one is just sitting back into child's pose, reaching the arms all the way overhead. We're just going to check and make sure that they don't have any pain with these maximal ranges of flexion and extension. So a painful indication here is going to lead to a positive for pain here. And if there is no pain, then we mark it a negative for pain. So moving on, let's take a look at a couple of tips for testing. We want to make sure that if the client is unable to perform a unilateral repetition, we instruct the client to repeat with a diagonal pattern for a score of 2. So as mentioned earlier, they can't get a 3. We check for the opposites to see if they have a 2. If they don't have a 2, it's a 1. The upper moving limb is going to indicate the side being tested as a review. Make sure the unilateral limbs remain over the board to achieve a score of 3. So to get that 3, we can't have them reaching all the way out over the top where they're not touching elbow to knee over the 2x6. That could be possible without having them get the 3. So let's make sure they're touching over the board to achieve the 3. The diagonal knee and elbow must meet over the board to get a 2, and that's if it's the diagonal pattern. Same issue there, just different scoring. And then we want to make sure that the spine is flat and the hips and shoulders are at right angles at the start. So we want them in that good, solid quadruped position with hands below shoulders and knees below hips, 90 degrees at the shoulders, 90 degrees at the hips. We're definitely going to retest or repeat the test on both sides, I should say, to make sure we're getting an indication on each one. Some of the nuances that could often be missed, as mentioned earlier, we want to double check, make sure we're always going back to that 90-degree position as we get them to try each test again. So make sure they don't sit back further or come forward more. That's going to change things. I see a lot of trainers sometimes and coaches get a little bit liberal with their 2s on this one. So a diagonal repetition should be under control. If you're seeing excessive flexion maybe on the T-spine, and just a lack of balance as they go through the test. Remember, we're taking a snapshot of the movement pattern. If it doesn't look like they have the stabilization or motor control through this alternating pattern of opposite arm, opposite leg, it should be a 1 in that case. We want to, as sort of mentioned here, we want to watch for excessive flexion on the back or the front side. So typically you'll see more of an upper body flexion. It's pretty rare that you'd see more flexion at the tailbone or at the hips, but you possibly could see it. There should be sort of a symmetrical flexion of the upper body and the lower body when they reach to touch elbow to knee. We shouldn't see excessive on one side or the other. Okay, and then one last thing is that the 2x6 does matter. So the distance between the hands and the knees. Don't try to save money by doing this test on your own, just on the floor, because that does make a difference. It's going to be a whole lot easier with your hands and knees close together. So we want to make sure we have that same 6-inch gap between the hands and the knees and feet. So that has been our testing for the rotary stability test in the functional movement screen. This is going to conclude our series on the FMS basics. It's been a pleasure to be able to share this information with you. Obviously, you can get a lot more information by going to functionalmovement.com to continue with some education on what to do after you're able to screen someone successfully. Where do you go from there? The screen's always going to tell you your next steps. It's a great idea to go ahead and learn from the guys at Functional Movement what those next steps would possibly be once you get your raw scores. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, that's going to do it for special episode 181.5 of the Strength Coach Podcast. Special thanks to Chris Poirier and the folks over at Perform Better. You can check them out at performbetter.com for their products and info on their educational seminars. Thanks to Frank Dolan for spending the last 7 weeks with us and going over the screen. Thanks to Functional Movement Systems. You can check them out at functionalmovement.com. And of course, remember, you can join strengthcoach.com and have access to the site for just $1, 3 days, just $1. Remember, this is the best place for access to Coach Boyle. He's on the forum every single day. Once your 3-day trial is over and you become a member, you'll be able to download Coach Boyle's 2 books, Designing Strength Training Programs and Facilities, as well as Advances in Functional Training. And remember, if you have a staff of 2 or more and you want to sign up as a group, we have a special membership offer for you, up to 50% off. To access that offer, go to strengthcoach.com, click the Join Now button to get started on your trial. My name is Anthony Wren, and you can reach me at strengthcoachpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you next time.